So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. And we have people joining this webinar from Africa, from India, from Europe, and we welcome you all. And our keynote presenter today is Brother Donal Leader. And just to say a little bit about Donal, Donal is a Christian brother. He's based in Dublin, in Marino, and he has experience during his time as a brother in education, experience in spirituality, and he was one of the people who set up ERI back in 2007, 2008. So he was involved in the establishment of Edmund Rice International in Geneva. And he has continued his interest in human rights and in advocacy ever since that time. And just to give two examples of the work Donal has been doing, this time last year, the Republic of Ireland was being reviewed under the Universal Periodic Review, and Donal and some other congregations in Ireland came together and prepared a submission for that particular review. And the topics that they covered back in November of last year were human trafficking, domestic violence, and migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees. And that was just a year ago in relation to the Republic of Ireland. And coming up next year in January, Donal was involved in preparing a submission for the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And again, Ireland is being reviewed by that committee at the UN. And in this case, Donal focused very much on the rights of the child, particularly in relation to children who drop out of school early school leavers. And he was reviewing the Irish government's policy in relation to early school leaving. So you can see that Donal has a varied background, and we look forward to the presentation he's going to give today, which, as Tino said, is focused on SDG 4, quality education. So Donal, we're looking forward very much to your presentation and to interacting with you through questions and clarifications as the presentation moves forward. So over to you, Donal.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Hello to you all, and good morning, as it may apply in all instances, I think. And I'm delighted to make this presentation this morning. I'm a bit nervous because, believe it or not, this is my first time ever doing a Zoom presentation. So if I fumble a little bit, you'll understand. Now, our topic this morning is the right to education. And it has been a conviction of mine for a long time. The right to education is central and core to the mission of Edmund Rice education throughout the world. So just to situate this for you a little bit, there are a number of key questions that arise when we consider the right to education, particularly that question, who actually goes to school? Because as we know, there are many young people who do not go to school. And we will look at some global statistics in that regard. We will look at the comparative context to see how different countries are doing, but most especially we will focus on the human rights context. Sorry, I've lost something here. Sorry about that. I'm coming back to the context here. So if you take a look at the map of the world in 1970, you can see that the situation is quite grim. You will see that there are many areas of the world which are in red or orange, and they're the countries of the world where the percentage of people over 18 have not received any education. We scroll forward to the year 2010, and you can see already that the situation has quite dramatically improved. You can see that the situation has improved, for example, particularly in India, and indeed in many countries in the rest of the world as well. The world is going to school, and access to education has improved quite dramatically in the last 30 years. Now, a point that I do wish to make is that the Edmund Rice education community has been significant in this, and particularly the schools run by the brothers and by the Edmund Rice community. Somewhere in the 1960s, something happened at the level of public thinking about education and about the need for education. And this took place mainly in the post-World War II context, particularly in situations where countries were undergoing decolonization. For example, here in Europe, there was quite a lot of thinking about education. And indeed, in my own country here in Ireland, a past pupil of the brothers, a man called T.K. Whitaker, a very famous man in Irish society, he was responsible for effectively turning around the country in relation to its investment in education. But in Europe, more generally, the person who is of immense significance is a man called Jacques Delors. He was the president of the European Commission, and he headed up an education commission in 1996, which was responsible for the report that became known ever since as the Delors report. And this report was highly influential. One of the things that he did was he placed a strong emphasis on the human person and on human development. And he identified what he called the 4 pillars of learning. Education, he said, is about learning to know. Obviously, that's knowledge, but not just knowledge, but also learning to do. So the whole area of craft education and technical education and the ways in which we interact with the world. Number 3 is a very significant one. Learning to be. He was very cognizant of the fact that knowing and doing are not enough unless we are in fact ethical people, moral people, and good people. So learning to be is a 3rd pillar of learning, he said. And the last one, which has a particular resonance here in Ireland, is learning to live together. And just recently, a wonderful past pupil of one of our schools in Northern Ireland was on TV in a documentary where he showed how schools can transform learning into a focus on living together. So as I said, Jacques Delors was central to looking at education in terms of human development. And that's the reason why today we see education as part of sustainable development, particularly SDG 4. SDG 4 is about quality education, but we understand that quality education is in fact education which is focused on human development, which develops the whole person, and is the essential and platform, the essential requisite for development in all other areas and sustainable development, particularly in the context of climate change. And we know that Pope Francis has been very strong on that issue. So the provision of education, which was announced in the Jacques Delors document back there in 1996, has found expression in its fullest form in SDG 4. But a point that I wish to make very strongly is that this story has a beginning way back with Edmund Rice. And Edmund Rice was not alone, he was part of a great tradition. And this tradition was one which began in Ireland even in the medieval period. Medieval monks went from Ireland to Europe and spread education. And Edmund Rice, as we know, looked through a window in Ballybricken. We know that story. But one of the points that I want to make, and I make continually now, is that Edmund Rice looked out through many, many windows. He was aware of the wider world, not only from his work on the quays of Waterford, but it is a personal conviction of mine that he also learned a lot from the Quakers. He was very friendly with the Quakers. And he often visited Dublin. On his trips to Dublin in that time, when he was traveling, he would have passed through a village called Ballator, which I often now visit. And there he would have seen one of the finest schools in the 18th century that was available to people, including Catholics. And Edmund Rice must have thought to himself when he saw that school, a school that educated Cardinal Paul Cullen and the great Shackleton, he must have thought to himself, why can't we have such schools for all our children? So I now want to focus on Catholic education specifically. And you can see that Catholic schools are a very significant presence in global education. From 1984 to 2019, the number of Catholic primary schools worldwide grew from 143,000 to 221,000. And it's no surprise that this expansion and increase has taken place mainly in Africa, but also in Latin America and Asia. And now I want you to take a look at this map, which is quite familiar to most of you, because what you see there is the spread of Edmund Rice brothers throughout the world, but also what you see there is the very significant contribution of Edmund Rice education to Catholic education. You will recognize the dates there for many of you where the brothers first came to Australia, to India, to the United States, to Bolivia, to Peru, Namibia, South Africa. So we are talking about education in the great tradition of human development. Now we look at the human rights instruments that are relevant for the right to education. And here is a timeline. And you can see that in the Universal Declaration, we find a mention of the right to education. In 1966, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, where we also see reference to the right to education. Then more recently, in 1989, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is quite explicit. The right to education is central to that. And now, more recently, with the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 4, the right to education. 1960, the United Nations in UNESCO issued in its declaration certain principles. The Convention Against Discrimination in Education, Article 4. So this is where we get to the issue of how do we actually implement the right to education? What does it mean in practice? So UNESCO 1960 made a very bold statement and established principles that are sort of an ideal. Number one, to make primary education free and compulsory. And indeed, that has been achieved in many countries, at least in the developed world, not so in the developing world. To make secondary education in its different forms generally available and accessible to all. And indeed, Edmund Rice education has been one of the main instruments in that particular area. Make higher education equally accessible to all on the basis of individual capacity. Well, we would all recognize we have a long way to go there. Assure compliance by all with the obligation to attend the school prescribed by law. Times past, there used to be a person who would come around from the Department of Social Welfare to check on that, but I think that's actually gone now, at least here in Ireland. So I now introduce you to a very significant person, because this person, who's Katarina Tomasevski, the Special Rapporteur on Education, who died in 2006, she laid out some principles on how do we actually achieve this implementation of the right to education. How do we achieve it? What needs to be done? These are her dates, 1950 to 2006. She was born in Zagreb in 1953. She was educated in Harvard, became an inspired promoter of human rights in various fields. Her main areas of focus were healthcare and education. She was appointed by the United Nations as the first ever Special Rapporteur on Education. She died in 2006. And the next point is the key one here. Her enduring legacy is the analytical perspective she developed, which provided policymakers and human rights advocates with a schema for reflecting on the implementation of the right to education. Now, what that actually means was she wasn't just satisfied with the ideal of the right to education or simply the enunciating of principles, but to come back to the issue of quality of education and how do we assure quality, she also gave us 4 criteria which enable us to assess quality in our delivery of education and quality in the way we do things in schools. She calls these the 4 A's, the 4A criteria. And they are that education should be available, education should be accessible, education should be acceptable, and education should be adaptable. You will find in the remainder of the presentation that I will focus very much on the last one, number 4, adaptability. The first one is availability. And availability obviously depends on a range of factors. Financing is a part of it. Teachers are a part of it. So again, we're talking about quality here. So to have quality education, you must have sufficient funding, usually from the state, but that does not happen in all countries. You must have trained teachers. And we know that in the history and story of the Edmund Rice education community, the training of teachers was a central part of that mission. Education must be pupil-centered, age-appropriate, pupil-centered. And again, that's a journey that we have to make in many countries. And availability is also about distance. I remember a time when most children had to walk to school. And I know from my visits to Africa and elsewhere that children have to walk quite long distances to get to school. So the availability of education means that we have to, in some way, address that issue of distance. In the Western world, it's often addressed by buses, school buses, but it still remains a huge obstacle to education for many young children today. So there are other obstacles as well, often legal, and that would, for example, pertain in the case of migrants and refugees who arrive in the country. Financial, very often poverty is a major barrier to education. Discrimination often is, as we now know, is a major barrier to education. And we are currently at the moment living through the ways in which people are suffering appallingly because of discrimination, especially discrimination, for example, in religious terms, and also in terms of gender and ethnicity. So we're talking here about the need to understand cultures, to understand peoples, and to do our best to acknowledge what the barriers are and see what we can do to remove them. And I know from the work in India that the advocacy work in India has been in large measure focused on addressing those obstacles and barriers. Now we come to acceptability. the third criterion, the third A. This again is an issue which is very relevant in many countries. And look at choice, for example, respecting parental choice is something that many countries still have not quite fully addressed in their legislation. Standards, minimum standards, and this is, of course, again, where quality of education comes in, that there needs to be some way in which standards are developed and some way in which standards can be measured. The language of instruction. Very often, the language of instruction may not be the language of the children themselves. And there will be a slide coming up shortly where you will see that at the moment, 40% of children who go to school do not receive instruction in their native language. And finally, there is the issue of censorship. Censorship has paradoxically in these times come to the fore. But there are ways in which political forces and sometimes social forces, they actually prevent you speaking on certain matters. Censorship in schools has actually now arisen in a number of circumstances. And this is the slide to which I referred to earlier, that 40% of young people who attend school today, according to the United Nations, do not access education in a language they understand. We have some experience of that here in Ireland because in times past, particularly in the 19th century, in the Irish language speaking areas, the actual language of instruction was English, which the children often did not understand. But today, 40% do not access education in a language they understand. And this is also an area where schools struggle in the contemporary context as well. For example, where you have in a school a large number of migrants and refugees from other countries, the school has to really make a big effort in this area. This one, which is number 4 in the 4 criteria, the 4 A's, is adaptability. Of all of the criteria, this is the one where I certainly have focused my attention this past while, and where I think the right to education really becomes relevant, and where the right to education really becomes a challenge for us. Adaptability. It can often be painful for schools to adapt. And we know that in the 1990s, a lot was written about educational change, school change. It was a common theme. And one of the learnings from that time was when it comes to adaptability, when it comes to a school adapting to new circumstances, it's a whole school process. It cannot be driven simply from the top. So adaptability comes into play, in particular where you have minorities. 20 years ago in Ireland, if you were talking about minorities, people would be really wondering what you were talking about. Today, in Ireland at least, we know full well that most of our schools have minority children, that is, children from minority groups. We have children from Afghanistan, from many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and now, of course, we have Ukrainians as well who are refugees. So adapting to their needs, schools adapting to their needs is a key challenge. And in the videos that will follow, you will see a wonderful example of how one school, we're talking about Mount Sion here, how Mount Sion has met that challenge of adaptability. Special needs. Again, we are learning that there are children coming to school who have particular needs. One of the needs which is very much to the fore nowadays and recognized more fully is the fact that there are children who are autistic in our schools. And again, Mount Sion has shown us the way here. Children with disabilities. Again, there's a strong emphasis today as far as possible to integrate children who are in any way challenged by a disability to be merged with the mainstream. And the last one is diversity. And here you have the challenge of recognizing diversity. And that began in Europe, again in the 90s, where the emphasis was on child-centered education. But today in Europe and in Ireland too, and in the rest of the world, particularly in Europe at the moment, the focus is on the new learners who are coming from diverse cultures and diverse contexts. I mentioned already the Ukrainian refugees, but also in the last year or two, the influx of students from Afghanistan, and before that, the students who have come from sub-Saharan Africa. There are very, very few schools in Ireland who do not have a proportion of their students from outside of Ireland. Another area where this issue of diversity comes into play is recognizing that one size does not fit all. And reference was made earlier to a report and a submission that was made in relation to an Irish Department of Education report on early school leaving. And one of the points we made in that submission that one size does not fit all. So now we're on home ground here, at least. We are here in Mount Sion, and this is Raver Crozy with two of the Afghani students. They happen to be twins, by the way. So these are representative of the number of students in Mount Sion who are of Afghani origin, who have come to us from Afghanistan and bring with them all the trauma and all the sorrow of that country. So inclusion and welcome is a form of adaptation, which is absolutely essential. And you will see that that is practiced in an excellent way in Mount Sion. This is a picture which at first glance you wouldn't have a notion what it is, but to me it is one of the most striking examples of how Mount Sion, and just to give Mount Sion as an example, how Mount Sion has adapted to the new students, particularly students who are Islamic in their faith. And in Mount Sion, the Afghani students in particular came to the head of the school and asked, look, on Fridays, we need to have a place where we can perform our ritual of Friday prayers. So the school very willingly responded and very creatively responded by creating a small prayer space at the end of one of the classrooms. And this is the Islamic prayer area for Afghani students who wish to perform their Friday obligations. A wonderful example of adaptation. Here is the ship room in Mount Sion, and just take a look at the flags, because it is a reality that there are so many schools, so many children today in Mount Sion who are of refugee or immigrant origin from all over the world, but particularly from Afghanistan, sub-Saharan Africa, and now Ukraine.
Colette, in the 23 years that you've been here, I'm sure you've seen a lot of change, both on faculty and student-wise, obviously. But have you seen the curriculum or the ethos or the culture, the community around Mount Sion change? How would you describe that?
I was a millennium baby, so I arrived here in January 2000 to the secondary school, to a time in Ireland where things were booming and we had the promise of a new school. Everything was really positive, numbers were high, and then the Celtic Tiger didn't last, and with it went our dreams of the new school. So everything just disappeared. I won't say overnight, but it certainly was, it seemed within a few months everything that we had dreamed of was gone, and it had a massive impact on numbers. So we went from a school that was doing well to a school with numbers decreasing dramatically, because you can imagine this new build was gone and everything that we had hoped for was disappearing in front of our eyes. But it took great leadership, and we had the most wonderful principal, John McArdle, who made us kind of look at the the small print. He was like, don't look at the big picture, this is going to overwhelm us, let's look at the small things that we can do right. And we had a makeover in the school, he got new windows, the electrics were done, all the things that weren't right for us, we fixed in a building. And not only was it the physical element, he built us as a staff then mentally, because our morale had gone so low. And I think once he started to fix us as a staff, it naturally then spread into the school community of the students. So, you know, they could see us gelling better as a team and that we were hopeful and positive. But it took a long number of years to get to where we are now. So have I seen changes? Absolutely. Did we need them? Without a doubt. Did Edmund guide us every step of the way?
Great. So you would describe what you have seen as being able to adapt to the situation in the Irish culture and here in Waldford. Part of your mission statement talks about being in a treating each other in a loving and caring manner. How has that changed over the years?
I have seen so many more Christian values nearly in the school develop over the years, and in some ways on paper you kind of think, oh, everything has gone right. So sometimes I've visited schools and all the policies are great, but actually on the ground it mightn't be as visible, whereas I actually think we put practice before policy. So we developed that caring and loving environment. We fixed up so many different things that, you know, that just weren't right for the students. And as we did that, then we put the policy after it. So if somebody did an inspection back in those early days, you probably went, oh, your policies aren't right, but the practice was right.
Yes.
And now I think we have both practice and policies. Not perfect, you'll never get it perfect, but that is the greatest adaptability, I think. You know, we looked at the student that was there in front of us and said, what does he need? You know, what is it that he actually needs to get the maximum out of our education system? And it's just such an honour to have been part of that.
Great, super, thank you.
So you watched this video from...
Colette, in the previous answer you talked about the school operating under a Christian value and seeing that how the boys treat each other and how the faculty and staff treat each other and how they treat each other, both students and faculty. Knowing that you serve about 37 different nationalities, most likely probably 37 different faith practices, how do you see all that coming together as an Edmund Rice educational component?
I'm a biology teacher, and I think the human connection is universal. People want to be loved and feel cared for, and no matter what religion they're, you know, follow or what culture they're in, that sense of a smile and a sense of warmth and belonging, you explicitly embed that within the school. And I think that's what we did. When the cultures, when we became much more multicultural, we nearly assumed, oh, the boys are happy, because they were often quieter, particularly the children that came from war-torn countries. We found that they were very quiet, so we went, oh, they're happy. But actually, as we started to develop the School of Sanctuary, we realised we hadn't listened to them. They were quiet, but we didn't hear their stories. And through the School of Sanctuary, I think that's where we developed our listening skills. Like the work that you do, Ray, you know, it's like, where are you from? Tell me your story. And last Friday I had a lovely experience when I was walking through the halls, and we have a number of Afghani students, and they said, Miss, come in here and look at where we're from. And they had Google Maps blown up on a big screen, and they were able to show me exactly the village in Afghanistan and their house and, you know, their schools. Yeah. But it blew me away. I was going, they still love home. You know, we kind of think, gosh, Ireland is brilliant, but they were saying, that's my home. And I suppose that's the difference, is that we see them now, we hear them, and we change our school to embrace them, rather than us assuming that everything is great and, you know, they're quiet, they're well behaved. But hearing a student is different in so many ways, and much better.
You spoke about this sanctuary school that Edmund Rice Education has here at Mount Zion. Could you elaborate a little bit about what that means?
So the School of Sanctuary is an award that's given to a school or a city or a town. It means, you know, that you embrace refugees, immigrants, and everybody. And we were the first school in Ireland that were awarded the School of Sanctuary. But really, if you rewind to Edmund's time, he provided sanctuary without ever an award, or with, it was innate to him, I think. And I think that's been the wonderful thing about watching the School of Sanctuary develop. It actually ties into everything that Edmund taught, and it's kind of been this melding together of all these different factors. And these children may come from 37 different countries, but they still want to be educated, they want to feel safe, they want to feel heard. And that's what Edmund did over 200 years ago in Waterford. We're just replicating it and putting more of a name on it.
Great, great, super, thanks.
Is this okay, what I'm saying?
Colette, earlier when you were talking about the young men who maybe leave after their first or second year for a variety of reasons, I could feel the emotion, I could feel your heart breaking for some of them. And if we know that the underpinning of an education really is to know, to be, to do, and to live together, knowing that that's a hope of the students who leave here, can you talk a little bit about the joys, I guess, that come with those who leave knowing, doing, being, and having the ability to live together beyond the walls of Mount Zion?
I think no matter how long they've been with us, a seed has been planted. And sometimes that seed flourishes while they're with us. But in my 23 years I've been here, I've met so many past pupils that may not have stayed with us for the full 6 years, but they'll meet me and kind of go, Miss, I remember when such and such a teacher did this for me. I remember when Mr. Doherty looked out for me and gave me a jumper. They're the things, and that living together, I think if you can embed what Edmund taught for however length of time, ideally 6 years is brilliant, but even if it's for 1 year, that seed has been set, and they might meet somebody else along the way that's going to kind of nurture that seed, and you know that it will germinate. And I suppose that living together, that's how I feel that we live together as a great family in school, and we have our ups and our downs, and we have times that we don't get on, and there's plenty of times in my role that I'm, you know, giving advice to students. But that's how you learn, isn't it? That's how you know, and you be, and you are, and you just get to live together and adapt, and yeah, it's wonderful.
Okay.
So a seed has been planted, and the good seed will grow. So in that video, you have heard a wonderful account of how a school can adapt. And you've heard Colette, for example, say how practice can inform policy. But she also spoke eloquently about love and compassion as an aspect of the school ethos, where people are appreciated, where the human dimension is to the fore, and where the knowing and the loving and the living together is a reality in the practice of the school in everyday life. I was really touched by that spontaneous expression that came from her. They still love home. So even though the school is a new home, they still love that home that they once knew in their own native lands. So another takeaway, which I think is important from this video, is going back to that issue of change. And she said very prophetically and very eloquently, she said that we change our school to embrace them. And that's the heart, I think, of what the right to education means in a Christian context. Now, our next video, in fact, is going to be the school principal in Mount Zion, who was Edward Kennedy.
Good day, Edward. Thank you for coming over to the Blessed Edmund Rice Chapel for this conversation. As you know, by being on this campus, it's kind of the heart of the whole campus rests right here in the chapel and stuff. So Edward, you've been principal for a couple of years now. Could you talk a little bit about how long you've been here at Mount Zion and what you did before becoming principal?
I will, yes. Good afternoon, Raymond. I was employed as a teacher in Mount Zion back in 1993. So I was employed as a metalwork teacher. I was taken in under a Christian brother at the time, Brother Kevin Codd. And I taught in the school for 27 years before I was promoted to the role of principal. But in terms of the students, when I started here, Our families, they were all from Waterford, and 99% of them were from Waterford. They were living in the streets surrounding the school here. Today, we have a very diverse school community. Presently, we have over 40 or close to 40 different nationalities in the school. So it's a very, very diverse school community. As well as that, I suppose we now have ASD classes in our school. So I do like to think in terms of inclusion that we have all the different types of learners in our school. We're catered for all of the different varieties of learners in Mount Zion.
Edward, for the sake of our viewers, could you elaborate a little bit what ASD means in the Irish context?
Yeah. ASD, it's a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. Now, some of our students do have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, and as a result of their formal diagnosis, some of our students would be entitled to a place in a special class where we do have teachers that are specially trained to teach boys with this diagnosis. And presently in Mount Zion, we have 2 classrooms set up to cater for boys on the ASD spectrum.
Right. How does that fit in with the charism of the Blessed Edmund Rice? It sounds like you're right there doing what Edmund Rice saw as a need years ago in Waterford.
It absolutely fits in with it, because in Mount Zion we're an inclusive school. Boys enroll in our school. We do absolutely everything we can as a school community to provide the needs, or to provide for the needs for each of our students. Every one of our students are unique. So in educating our boys, we provide facilities that will cater for all the different needs of our learners.
All right. Knowing that you have that much of a diversity here in school, what have you done as principal or overseen to prepare your staff? Because they're the ones actually in the trenches of the classroom. But as a principal, you're seeing the global picture of the school. What have you done to help your students or your faculty work with your students, the diversity of your student population?
Training is key to this. We engage with the PDST, which is we provide training or it's professional training for Irish teachers. So we do training on diversity. We have a number of teachers that are trained as what's called EAL teachers, English as an additional language teachers. Because as you can imagine, as a diverse community, we do have many students who don't have English as their first language. And in order for those students to succeed in our school, we prioritise the learning of English when they enrol in our school initially. So training is key for our staff. You have that, you're dealing with adults in the community, you are dealing with your teachers, your SNAs. So I suppose it's just dealing with so many different people. I have to be honest, I've learned a huge amount since I've gone into this role.
Edward, earlier you talked about the community and your role as principal, and that's the wider community that feeds into Mount Zion. And you mentioned earlier too that there's about 37 different nationalities involved right now in the community, probably different faith life and faith practices. How do you see your role as principal to bring that together in an Edmund Rice education and to work with your faculty to also embrace that?
I'm going to go right back to basics there. As an Edmund Rice school, and one of the qualities of an Edmund Rice school has been compassionate, been caring, and been kind. And I'll be honest, you mentioned 37 different nationalities, and you'll have boys and their families who won't speak English when they arrive into our school. But it is absolutely about the way you care for those boys and their families when they come to Mount Zion. And in terms of getting buy-in from the staff in Mount Zion, it is something that I would emphasise to our staff at staff meetings. In all our dealings with our boys, it is about being caring, being kind, showing compassion. Now, in Mount Zion, we were very, very lucky because of all of the very good work that we are doing with our nationalities. We were awarded School of Sanctuary status in December 2020. And we were awarded that status, the first school to get that status in the country, because of the very good work that we were doing with our students to include them in our school. You mentioned about the Edmund Rice ethos, and I suppose Edmund Rice opened his first school here in 1802, and at the time it was for the poor boys of Waterford City, and he saw education as a way out of poverty for those boys. Here we are over 200 years later, our diverse community, over 37 different nationalities. I see my role here very similar to this day. I have boys from different cultures, different backgrounds, arriving to our school every few days. And I'll be honest, as a school community, we would do everything we can to open them, or to welcome them with open arms.
Great. Knowing that you walk on campus and you see the sign outside there about an Edmund Rice campus and the 3 schools that kind of go on here, what's your role in the sense of bringing those 3 communities together? What do you see your role as an administrator for the secondary school?
I think it's very, very important, being the principal of the school here, not to see myself just as the principal of the post-primary school. There are 3 different entities on this campus. We have the Edmund Rice Centre, we have Mount Sion Primary and the post-primary school. And we are all interlinked. Now it does present challenges for us, but we do need to remember that we are all connected on the one campus. So I suppose going forward, it's always very, very important that there is communication channels opened between the 3 entities, because when we work together, we're very, very supportive of one another. And I suppose if I take the example of the primary school, Mount Sion Primary School would be our main feeder school in the post-primary school. The majority of boys in the primary school would go to secondary school in Mount Sion post-primary. So they're a direct feeder school for us. Plus also the Edmund Rice Centre. In recent times, since our school numbers have increased, we are now holding classes in the Edmund Rice Centre. So the Edmund Rice Centre is very much becoming part of the post-primary school experience on the campus. We would hold monthly celebrations in the Edmund Rice Chapel. We use the ship room and we use other rooms in the Edmund Rice Centre. So I suppose the fact we are in and out of the Edmund Rice Centre and the boys coming to school here are in and out of the centre, they see the Edmund Rice Centre as being part of the school.
Great, great. Knowing that there's a purpose to education, basically there's a philosopher out there that has written to describe education as to know, to do, to be, and to live together. With those 4 principles underlying education, and probably underlying an Edmund Rice education, how do you see that as part of the secondary school's culture here?
I suppose that the first point you made there, Raymond, was to know, and from a school's point of view, it's to know the students that are coming into your school. You know, knowing those students, knowing their strengths, knowing where they're coming from, knowing their family backgrounds. That's your starting point. The next thing you look at to be, you know, and I suppose what you want for those students. As a school, you know, where do we want those students, or what do we want to achieve with those students? Now, obviously, knowing what you want those students to achieve, you can then focus on how you can ensure that that happens. But our boys, they come into post-primary school, we want to ensure that we provide an education for them, that they end up being the best that they can possibly be, that they transition well into the school, that they get the avail of all the opportunities that we can provide for them as a school community, and that when they get to the end of their 6 years in the school, that we can help them in terms of transitioning, leaving our school, going on to whether it's 3rd level college or directly into a workplace. But knowing your student and knowing their backgrounds is the starting point in relation to that.
Great, great. Edward, thank you for joining me this afternoon. It's been enlightening. You've said an awful lot, and I can see the passion and the enthusiasm that you have for the boys here at Mount Zion. Your mission statement talks about Mount Zion as a place where our children can develop and mature physically, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually in a safe and caring environment. And this afternoon we've talked about that safe and caring environment, both the role that you as an administrator play in it and your staff to treat the boys and welcome them, to know that Edmund Rice offered compassion, presence to the young men when he was opening his first school, and it continues. As you know, just down the block here is the first school was opened in 1802. What you're still doing here at Mount Zion is wonderful work, and we thank you for that. And really, the Edmund Rice ethos is alive and well and continues to go on for hopefully many, many more years. Thank you.
Thank you, Raymond.
So we thank Edmund and Raymond for that presentation there. And we also acknowledge what he said about how the school has been transformed from an inner city school to being a school that is open and welcoming. I noted in particular his motto of being compassionate, caring, and being kind. I also noted the emphasis he placed on training and professional development, because to achieve that level of transformation, some kind of training is needed. And I particularly was impressed by the fact that Mount Zion has been the first school in Ireland to be awarded the title of School of Sanctuary, which says a lot about the vitality and power of the ethos, the Edmund Rice ethos in the school. So here are the two questions. We're offering these two questions for your reflection. How are Edmund Rice schools in your local context? How are your schools adapting to the new needs today? And then the second question, arising from the presentation, what inspires you to seek new ways of giving expression to Edmund Rice education in the context of today's world?
On your behalf, I thank Donal for his presentation and for reminding us that the right to education is a key human right and one that is central to the mission of Edmund Rice Schools and our Edmund Rice network. And we also thank Donal for highlighting and explaining the 4A framework, key aspects of the implementation of the right to education, particularly in regard to adaptability. And with Brother Raymond for the interviews with Colette and Edward that shared the examples from Mount Zion Waterford that demonstrate the restructuring and the reorientation of the education they offer, initiatives that better cater to the needs of the diverse range of students that they now serve. So I'm sure we all have much to reflect upon and ideas to consider that might be applied in our own local situation, arising from the presentation and from the sharing in the breakout groups. And I also thank Tino for all his work in organising and promoting this webinar, as well as providing the technical assistance to ensure that it ran smoothly. And finally, I thank all of you, our participants who have joined us today, and I hope the webinar has been of value. So thanks to everyone, and